Imagine waking up to the sound of pots clanging, arguments echoing down the hallway, and water pipes groaning through century-old walls. Not in a busy hostel or a crowded dormitory, but in your own home. This was the everyday reality for millions of people across the Soviet Union. Welcome to the world of communalkas, the Soviet communal apartment, where space was tight, tempers were tighter, and privacy was a fantasy. Before we dive deeper into this rarely told side of history, take a moment to support this channel. If you find these stories intriguing, please hit the like button and consider subscribing. Your support helps us bring forgotten human experiences like this to life, and we would love to know where in the world you are listening from. Drop a comment with your location and time it is. Amazing how many of you fall asleep to history from all corners of the globe. Now, let us go back in time. It is 1953. The streets of Leningrad are quiet beneath a dull gray sky. Inside one of the city's many pre-revolutionary buildings, divided haphazardly into dozens of small living quarters, a young woman named Irina opens her eyes to another cold morning. Her family's entire life fits into one single room, barely 150 square feet. Her parents sleep on the pull-out sofa, and she shares a folding cot with her younger brother. The walls are stained from decades of cooking and heating with kerosene. There is a small wooden table under the window that doubles as a dining space and a study desk. On one wall, their winter coats hang neatly above crates used for storage. There is no closet, no dresser, and certainly no concept of a bedroom. But this is not unusual. It is standard. In fact, it is considered fortunate. They live in a communalka, a form of communal housing that emerged after the Russian Revolution and became widespread under Stalin. These apartments, once grand spaces for aristocratic families, were subdivided by the state into multi-family units. A 5-room apartment might now house 7 or 8 different families, each assigned a single room with shared use of the kitchen, bathroom, and hallway. Irina hears footsteps in the corridor. Someone's already in the kitchen, and the bathroom is locked. She will need to wait in line to brush her teeth. In the background, a baby cries in another room, while 2 men argue about soap usage. Tensions like these are normal. When 10 people share one stove and one bathroom, conflict is inevitable. Outside, snow dusts the windowsill. Inside, the air is thick with the smell of cabbage soup, cigarette smoke, and damp wool. And yet, despite the discomfort, these tight spaces bred a strange kind of intimacy. People learn to live with each other's rhythms, knowing who woke up early, who hogged the hot water, and who always burned the porridge. For Irina and millions like her, this was not just a chapter of childhood. It was a way of life, a defining feature of Soviet urban existence. And this is just the beginning. Stay with us as we journey deeper into the real Soviet experience, raw, revealing, and far more human than any Cold War stereotype. For Irina, the morning never began with peace or silence. It began with calculation. Before her eyes fully opened, her ears were already listening. Was the bathroom free? Could she hear the low rumble of the water heater through the paper-thin wall? Had Galina from room number 4 already slipped in before dawn again, soaking the floor with steam and locking the door behind her for 20 solid minutes of uninterrupted privacy? Time was everything in a communalka. To miss your moment was to invite a minor disaster, missing work, being scolded at school, or enduring glares from neighbors who believed you were deliberately slowing down the entire shared rhythm of the building. So Irina learned to be strategic. At just 17, her mind ran like a soldier's drill. Rise, dress, wait by the bathroom door, toothbrush and cup in hand, ready to dart inside. Between rotations, a minute wasted was a minute stolen from someone else, and you never wanted to be seen as selfish in a world that prized collective discipline. The bathroom, when she managed to enter, was a battlefield of traces left behind, soaked towels slung over door hooks, half-used soap crumbling in trays, and a mirror fogged over from a dozen previous breaths. A metal basin stood under the sink to catch leaks, and the ceiling bore the permanent water stains of a pipe that no one could afford to fix. But this was not cause for complaint. Complaining did not get the pipes fixed. Complaining only created more friction, more whispers behind doors, more awkward silences in the kitchen. Instead, you learned to move fast, keep your space clean, and avoid the kind of behavior that earned you a nickname behind your back. By the time Irina returned to the family room, her father had already turned on the radio, carefully tuned to the day's official news bulletin. Her mother was in the kitchen queue, waiting for the gas burner. The communal kitchen, where every meal was an exercise in patience and negotiation, was a theater of unspoken rules. Each family was allocated a small corner, a shelf for dry goods, a portion of the fridge if there was one, a tiny slice of countertop. There were labels on everything, but that did not stop accusations when food went missing. Sometimes it was rats. Often it was just hunger. When Irina took her turn, she boiled water for tea and set a pot of kasha simple porridge on the stove, careful not to use too much flame. The gas pressure was unreliable, and a sudden flare-up might blow out the burner entirely, leaving her to light a match with trembling fingers while the woman next to her looked on, tapping her foot. There was no room for clumsiness here. There was no time to reflect on hunger or comfort. You cooked, you cleaned, you left. It was not always cold, but it often felt that way. Not just because of the draft that slipped through unsealed windows or the radiators that clicked but never warmed, but because comfort itself was seen as a luxury. A soft chair, a silent room, a moment alone. These were not things Soviet citizens expected. Instead, they learned to treasure smaller victories. A fresh loaf of black bread from the bakery, a packet of tea from a cousin in Estonia, or a morning when the toilet was actually clean and unoccupied. Irina returned to the family room where her brother was already dressing for school. He buttoned his shirt with care, as their mother had taught him clothes clean, shoes polished, posture straight. We may be poor, but we are not undignified. He smiled at her, teeth freshly brushed with baking soda instead of toothpaste, and together they sat at the small table, steaming bowls between them. The quiet between spoonfuls was not awkward, it was efficient. Every gesture in the morning was calibrated for maximum usefulness. Setting out clothes, checking school books, tying shoelaces, sharing sugar 1 cube at a time. Down the hallway, footsteps echoed again. More doors opened. Someone knocked at the bathroom, and a voice inside shouted back, irritated. Pots banged. The hallway light flickered once, then stabilized. Another day had begun inside this fragmented home, where dozens of people shared one corridor, one kitchen, one bathroom, and one city gas line. Outside, the sky was turning from gray to white. Leningrad in winter rarely saw sunlight, but it did not need to. The people inside the Kommunalka did not live by the sun. They lived by the rhythm of duty, of alarm clocks and ration lines, of school bells and factory whistles. Irina put on her coat-thick wool, inherited from her aunt, and pulled the scarf tightly around her neck. In her pocket were 3 kopecks and a metal ration token for bread. Her father gave her a quiet nod as she stepped out the door. She would not see him until dinner. He would return after dark, smelling of machine oil and frost. Irina walked past the other doors, where muffled conversations and clinking dishes reminded her that she was not alone and never would be. In the narrow stairwell, the paint peeled from the walls, and someone had left a broken umbrella in the corner. Outside, the city waited. But so did the long queue at the bus stop. The shared spaces were not just inside the building. They extended everywhere in the lines for food, in the crush of the tram, in the silence between neighbors trained to look but not speak. This was not a dystopia. It was not a paradise either. It was something more complicated, an entire world built on closeness without connection, familiarity without freedom. And in it, people like Irina learned to navigate each day with grace, resilience, and a kind of hope that did not need to shout to survive. In the heart of the Soviet Union's daily life, food was not merely sustenance. It was a calculated ritual, a constant negotiation with scarcity. For the average Soviet citizen, the availability of basic staples like sugar, meat, or coffee was not guaranteed. It was not as simple as walking into a store with money and leaving with groceries. Instead, it was an intricate dance of waiting, rationing, and leveraging connections. The morning often began with the rattle of a metal cart, or the whisper of a neighbor who'd heard that a delivery truck had arrived at the local gastronome. Word spread quickly, faster than any official announcement, and people would dash from their homes, scarves half-tied, to claim a place in line. These queues could stretch around the block, even in biting cold or pouring rain. But standing in line did not guarantee success. Sometimes, the shelves would be empty before one reached the counter. Other times, what was available was not what was needed. Still, people waited because there was always the chance. Sugar was a luxury. It was rationed, measured out in grams, and guarded like treasure. Families used it sparingly, often saving their monthly allotment for a holiday cake or a rare jar of homemade jam. A spoonful in tea was considered indulgent. Coffee, if it could be found at all, was usually instant or a bitter substitute made from chicory. Real ground coffee was a mythical product, whispered about, gifted during New Year celebrations, or stashed away for weddings. Meat was another story. In theory, Soviet markets offered pork, beef, and chicken. In practice, however, what reached the counters was unpredictable. Ground meat, sausages made with more filler than flesh, or grayish cuts of questionable origin, were far more common than quality selections. Housewives and grandmothers became experts at stretching every gram, turning bones into soup, leftovers into pies, and fat trimmings into cooking grease. Creativity was not optional. It was survival. To navigate this scarcity, people relied heavily on their sviazi connections. A cousin who worked at a bakery might set aside a loaf of fresh black bread before it vanished. A friend employed in a state distribution center might quietly call ahead if butter was expected in stock. These were not acts of corruption. They were part of a silent, unspoken system of mutual dependence. Everyone helped someone, and in return, they hoped to be helped. This network of favors filled the gaps left by a state that could not quite meet its promises. Special goods, the kind that did not make it to public shelves, became a currency of their own. Chocolates wrapped in foreign foil, real citrus fruits, or canned fish from abroad were not just food. They were symbols of status and rare fortune. Often, they were stored untouched, displayed in cabinets behind glass, or brought out only during the most important events. A child's graduation, a marriage proposal, a relative's funeral. These items carried emotional weight, not because of their price, but because of their rarity. Holidays were the focal point of Soviet food culture. Months of planning went into preparing for New Year's Eve, the most celebrated night of the year. Housewives stockpiled ingredients slowly, hunting down mayonnaise for Olivier salad, cans of green peas, herring for shuba, and sweetened condensed milk for cakes. Families sacrificed other meals, cut corners on clothing, or bartered with neighbors to assemble a proper feast. For one night, the table would be full, the apartment would smell of home-cooked dishes, and for a few hours, scarcity would be forgotten. Bartering was a way of life, not just for food, but for almost everything. A bar of soap might be exchanged for a few eggs. A pair of imported pantyhose could fetch a whole chicken. Soviet citizens became experts in informal trade, carefully balancing their needs with their social capital. Often, transactions took place quietly in stairwells, whispered at work, or brokered through trusted acquaintances. It was not that money had no value, but that relationships had more. Children grew up understanding these rules without being taught. They knew which stores were most likely to receive chocolate, which uncles could find oranges, and that speaking out loud about certain exchanges was unwise. Even celebrations were shaped by availability. A child's birthday cake might be flavored with ersatz cocoa, but it was made with love and determination. Despite the difficulty, Soviet citizens did not succumb to despair. There was pride in making do, in finding joy amid restriction, in showing hospitality even when cupboards were bare. Sharing a hard-earned candy or a tiny slice of sausage was a gesture of trust, a bond between neighbors forged by the very scarcity they endured. What makes this period so unique is the contradiction it embodies. On paper, the state guaranteed employment, shelter, and basic goods. But in practice, the system often stumbled, and it was the resilience of ordinary people that kept daily life running. Their ingenuity, their informal networks, their quiet sacrifices, these were the real engines of survival. And through it all, food remained central, not just for nourishment, but as a symbol of identity, celebration, and community. In a world of quotas and rations, every meal was more than a plate. It was an achievement, a statement of perseverance, a reminder that even in the tightest constraints, people could still gather, laugh, and share. In the Soviet Union, work was not just a necessity, it was a duty, a cornerstone of life tied to identity, social status, and survival. From the moment one left school, the state assigned jobs based on perceived needs, qualifications, and loyalty. There was no unemployment, at least not in the official sense. Everyone contributed to the collective effort, whether in sprawling factories, government offices, mines, or agricultural collectives. The rhythm of life was synchronized with the shift bell, the clatter of machinery, and the quiet expectations of the 5-year plans. Inside the walls of massive industrial complexes where soot stained the windows and concrete corridors echoed with the clang of metal, workers labored under strict productivity quotas. These targets were not mere suggestions. They were official metrics tied to awards, punishments, and prestige. Each quota was part of the grand narrative of building socialism proof of progress. Missing a target could lead to reprimands or docked pay, while exceeding, one might earn a public mention on the honor board or a certificate signed by the party secretary. But the reality beneath the slogans was far messier. Equipment was often outdated, supplies erratic, and repairs left to the creativity of the workforce. A single missing part could halt an entire assembly line, prompting teams to improvise with salvaged scraps or to barter with other factories through an informal but essential underground economy. Workers might trade a box of surplus screws for a length of wiring or a critical tool. Resourcefulness became a virtue not celebrated on posters, but quietly respected among colleagues. Discipline was paramount. Timekeeping was strict, and tardiness, especially repeated, could lead to public shaming or worse demotion or loss of privileges. Supervisors kept careful logs, and absenteeism without permission was a serious offense. Yet, paradoxically, many workers developed subtle forms of resistance, quietly stretching break times, working slowly, or exchanging favors to balance out workloads. The notion of, we pretend to work, and they pretend to pay us, became an unspoken truth by the 1980s. But in earlier decades, there remained a powerful sense of purpose. For many, pride in their labor still burned brightly. Engineers, machinists, chemists, and teachers genuinely believed they were building a better world. This idealism was especially strong among those who remembered the chaos of civil war or the poverty of the pre-revolutionary era. Their jobs gave them structure, purpose, and often a social circle colleagues with whom they shared not only tasks, but celebrations, meals, and frustrations. Women played a major role in the workforce. They worked in textile factories, schools, hospitals, and even in heavy industry, though they juggled professional expectations with domestic duties. Cooking, queuing for food, and raising children, they were essential to the functioning of Soviet society. State propaganda celebrated the female tractor driver, the woman engineer, the heroic nurse. But behind the posters lay exhaustion and endless balancing acts. Labor extended beyond the workplace. Saturdays often included Subotnick's voluntary but socially expected community workdays, where people cleaned parks, painted fences, or repaired communal spaces. Participation was both a show of loyalty and a means of social standing. Opting out was possible, but it left a mark. And yet, for all its rigidity, the Soviet workplace could foster deep camaraderie. In factories and offices, people brought snacks to share, marked birthdays with modest celebrations, and supported one another through hardship. The stress of quotas and shortages was tempered by solidarity. A mechanic might help a friend fabricate a part after hours. A teacher might trade extra tutoring in exchange for help getting her radiator fixed. Evenings often ended with tired bodies and aching hands. Workers would ride packed trams home, where lines still awaited them not in the factory, but at the bread shop or the communal kitchen. The day might end with a cup of weak tea, a newspaper, and the hum of state television. Yet despite the challenges, many found dignity in their labor. The work may have been hard, the rules unyielding, and the pay modest, but it connected them to something larger, a nation striving to rise, to build, to endure. In the Soviet Union, where nearly every citizen was guaranteed a job by the state, work was not merely a means to earn a living. It was a platform where political loyalty and professional identity intertwined. The state placed immense importance on labor, turning every factory floor, school, and construction site into a theater of ideological performance. But securing advancement was not just about showing up on time and fulfilling your duties. It was about proving that you were ideologically sound, dependable in both output and belief. For many Soviet workers, daily life revolved around meeting strict production targets. These were not just goals. They were mandates issued from the highest levels of government. Fulfilling your quota was not a badge of excellence. It was the minimum expectation. And often, these quotas were unrealistic, set without regard to the available resources or machinery conditions. A machinist in Leningrad might be ordered to produce 30 parts a day with equipment that could barely make 15. Improvisation became a survival skill. Workers recycled worn-out tools, bartered for spare parts, or used personal networks to keep the lines moving. Efficiency was often secondary to appearances. Numbers had to be met, even if the process required bending reality. Yet for those aiming to move up the ladder, technical skill alone would never be enough. In every workplace, from textile plants in Siberia to bureaucratic offices in Moscow, personal advancement hinged heavily on the perception of loyalty. This meant attending political meetings, publicly supporting the party line, and volunteering for officially sanctioned activities. Workers were expected to take part in Saturday volunteer labor, or sabbatniks, sweeping streets, planting trees, or repairing buildings, not because they were paid to do it, but because it showed commitment to collective ideals. This performative loyalty often created a double life for employees. On one side was the public figure, the model Soviet citizen who quoted party slogans and accepted medals during state ceremonies. On the other side was the private individual who navigated daily frustrations with a weary sense of realism. Advancement was not always about being the most productive worker. It was often about being noticed at the right time by the right superior, a well-timed speech at a union meeting, an enthusiastic note of praise from a factory manager, or a commendation in the company newsletter could open doors that sheer productivity never would. Even praise was a political tool. Being commended by a supervisor was not just a matter of pride, it was a marker of trust, signaling to the system that you could be counted on. Once trusted, opportunities followed. You might be offered a slightly larger apartment, a spot in a better educational institute for your child, or even access to special stores where food and imported goods were more readily available. All of these perks were tangible rewards for ideological reliability. In the communal apartments of Moscow, a janitor who received recognition for outstanding socialist labor could walk a little taller among neighbors. On factory floors, workers who were part of the shock worker movement, the elite group praised for surpassing quotas, enjoyed certain privileges, sometimes even being invited to travel for exhibitions or conferences. These recognitions were more than just status. They were survival tools, paths to comfort, in an environment where everything from sugar to soap could be scarce. But the pressure to maintain this image took its toll. The need to constantly demonstrate loyalty led to a culture of self-censorship. Jokes were shared only with trusted friends. Private thoughts were guarded, even within families. A slip of the tongue or a poorly timed complaint could cost someone not just a promotion, but their reputation, or worse, their freedom. Workplace politics was not just about ambition. It was a careful game of appearances, risk, and quiet negotiation with the ever-present shadow of the state. Still, many took pride in their work. Despite the constraints, engineers built bridges, scientists pursued research, and artists continued to create. Their achievements, often in the face of logistical shortages and bureaucratic interference, demonstrated resilience and determination. But beneath these accomplishments was always the hum of uncertainty, of knowing that each success had to be aligned with the party's vision, and that true progress was measured not just in results, but in conformity. This dance between dedication and performance defined the rhythm of Soviet professional life. It was a world where the factory siren signaled more than the start of a shift. It marked another day of navigating a system that demanded not only sweat and skill, but constant proof of allegiance. And for millions, it was the only world they knew. In Natasha's world, childhood was far from carefree. From the moment she stepped into school, her days were carved into strict routines that mirrored the larger machinery of the Soviet state. The classroom was not just a place of learning, it was a place of shaping citizens. The walls were decorated not with whimsical colors or fairy tales, but with portraits of party leaders and banners. Urging discipline and loyalty, students stood to greet their teachers, recited official slogans in unison, and began each day with the same determined order that characterized adult work life. Natasha, like her peers, quickly learned that success in school meant more than just good grades. It meant fitting the mold of the ideal young Soviet citizen. Her textbooks were uniform across the country, each word approved, each lesson serving a greater ideological purpose. History emphasized revolutionary heroes and class struggle, often focusing more on collective triumphs than individual nuances. Science and mathematics were taught with rigor, a point of national pride and a necessity for keeping pace in the Cold War era. But even in these subjects, the underlying message was clear: the achievements of science belonged to the people, to the state, to progress. Personal expression was encouraged only within the lines drawn by the system. Critical thinking was not the priority. Memorization, discipline, and unwavering participation were. Civic education formed a core part of Natasha's schooling. She joined the Young Pioneers, a rite of passage for nearly all children in the Soviet Union. The red scarf tied around her neck was both a symbol of honor and a reminder of responsibility. Meetings were held regularly, filled with chants, songs, and stories about model citizens. Through these experiences, Natasha learned not just the words of her textbooks, but the deeper expectations that governed her life: loyalty, unity, and service. Volunteering for neighborhood cleanups, attending commemorative parades, and participating in state ceremonies were not optional. They were integral to growing up Soviet. Her teachers, often under pressure themselves, worked hard to maintain order and meet performance benchmarks. Their roles extended beyond academics. They were seen as moral guides and political educators. A child who struggled with the material was not just falling behind. They were seen as needing ideological reinforcement. Parents were called in, not just to discuss grades, but to align family values with the school's goals. For Natasha, the boundary between home and school often blurred. Her parents supported the school's teachings, reinforcing them at the dinner table, and during evening discussions, everyone was in sync. There was little room for contradiction. Despite the rigidity, there were moments of joy. Natasha loved literature, especially the stories of heroism and sacrifice. These narratives, while carefully curated, inspired a sense of purpose and connection to something larger than herself. She and her classmates wrote essays about future careers in service to the nation's scientists, doctors, engineers, all roles that promised to advance the collective good. Dreams were not selfish pursuits, but contributions to the motherland. But even joy came with structure. Holidays were state-sanctioned and filled with protocol. New Year's celebrations were popular, with dead Moreaus delivering gifts, but even this was framed within an educational and moral narrative. Natasha's birthday parties were modest, often shared in cramped apartments with other children from her housing block, everyone contributing something small: a slice of cake, a homemade toy, a recited poem in honor of the day. These moments, however regulated, were cherished and meaningful in their own way. The pressure to perform and conform began early. Academic performance was tracked, not just by grades, but through behavior reports and civic participation logs. Natasha learned that rewards did not only come from studying hard, but from standing out as an ideal pupil. Being chosen to carry the school's flag at assembly or to recite poetry at a national celebration brought prestige not just to her, but to her family. It signaled alignment with the values the state held dear. Still, underneath the surface, there were whispered conversations between parents, sometimes among older students, about the challenges of such a system. Some children found it difficult to keep up. Others struggled with the lack of creative freedom. Yet these thoughts were rarely voiced openly. Even children understood the importance of discretion. Natasha did not question the system. She did not need to. Everything was arranged for her: her days, her path, her purpose. Life was predictable, safe in its routine, and filled with the comforting certainty that everyone was in it together. As she walked home from school, her satchel heavy with books, Natasha passed posters reminding citizens of their duties, of the greatness of the Soviet experiment. She would sometimes stop to stare, internalizing their messages without resistance. For her, they were not propaganda, they were truth. Her future, she believed, was bright, as long as she followed the path laid out before her. And so, each day, she returned to her desk, pencil in hand, ready to memorize, recite, and serve, because to do so was not just expected, it was natural. In the rare moments when the machinery of Soviet life allowed for pause, citizens found brief sanctuaries in the carefully curated experiences of state-run sanatoria, communal gatherings, and cultural outings. These were not luxurious retreats by any global standard, but for people like Natasha's family, they represented moments of quiet contrast in an otherwise tightly controlled and demanding existence. After months of navigating shortages, juggling factory expectations, and carefully towing the line between private thought and public allegiance, these state-sanctioned vacations felt like breathing spaces carved from the stone of duty. Natasha remembered her first trip to a sanatorium nestled deep in the pine forests near the Black Sea. The long train ride had been filled with songs sung in unison, an accordion echoing down the aisles, and an elderly woman offering sunflower seeds to the children. The facility itself, painted in faded pastel tones, was rigidly organized wake-up calls with soft bells, morning exercises, scheduled walks along shaded trails, and prescribed mineral water sessions to restore socialist vigor. Even rest was structured. But for Natasha, who was used to the cramped silence of a communalka, the open air and quiet walks offered a kind of freedom she did not know she craved. The adults attended lectures on labor heroism or watched approved plays in outdoor amphitheaters, clapping rhythmically at scripted moments of ideological triumph. There were folk dance performances, film nights showcasing Soviet achievements, and recitations of poetry extolling the working man's glory. But what Natasha remembered most vividly were the communal bonfires. People gathered in large circles under the stars, passing warm mugs of kvass and singing old folk songs that somehow escaped ideological boundaries. For a brief moment, the rigid outlines of identity worker, student, loyal citizen blurred into something more human, Back in the city, cultural life had a similar duality. Attending the ballet or the opera was both an artistic experience and an affirmation of the state's pride in Soviet culture. Tickets were affordable, but not always available, requiring connections or good fortune. Natasha's father, a factory foreman, once bartered 2 jars of pickled mushrooms for a pair of theater passes. That evening, dressed in their best, they watched Swan Lake from the balcony of the Bolshoi Theater. The performance was breathtaking, the dancers floating like ghosts across the stage. But even more powerful was the shared experience. Hundreds of strangers swept into collective awe. Evenings in the communal apartments were another kind of cultural gathering. After the evening news broadcast, families might come together in the common kitchen to share tea, tell stories, or quietly celebrate a name day. An old radio played patriotic songs, or sometimes crackled with Western jazz, smuggled through the airwaves, which they listened to in whispered amusement. These nights were charged with both camaraderie and caution, where laughter coexisted with the knowledge that one misstep in conversation could have lasting consequences. Public spaces were designed to foster unity, parks filled with sculptures of workers and soldiers, broad plazas that hosted parades, and libraries stocked with approved literature. Natasha loved wandering through the House of Pioneers, where children could learn crafts, join clubs, and rehearse for political pageants. She had once starred in a school play about Lenin's childhood, proudly wearing a red scarf as the audience of parents and party officials applauded. All of these activities, rest, culture, leisure, were not just amenities but carefully woven threads in the broader fabric of Soviet life. They aimed to reinforce collective identity, loyalty, and shared values. There was beauty in the structure, certainly, and a sense of being part of something larger. But there was also a quiet, persistent awareness that every outing, every story told, every song sung beneath the stars was part of a narrative larger than oneself, one that left little space for questioning. For Natasha, these experiences remained bittersweet. She grew up with a deep appreciation for community, tradition, and resilience, but she also carried the weight of silence, the things unspoken. During bonfire nights, the glances exchanged when a forbidden book was quietly passed between hands, or when someone suddenly stopped coming to gatherings. Leisure in the Soviet Union, like so many aspects of daily life, was shaped not just by what it offered, but by what it deliberately left out. By the time the sun had risen over the gray concrete skyline of the Soviet town, the rhythm of daily life had already begun. A uniform routine guided millions like cogs turning in a vast machine, each one moving in sync, propelled by duty, survival, and the quiet calculations of caution. Public life required performance. Words had weight, silence could be wise, and every gesture might carry double meaning. For most citizens, especially those who had come of age under the regime, navigating daily life involved managing 2 versions of reality, one spoken aloud, and another kept tucked safely in the privacy of one's thoughts. In this tightly controlled world, public conformity was more than a habit. It was often the only viable path. Saying the right things at the right time was not just social grace, it was self-preservation. At work, people repeated slogans, clapped during meetings, and joined official marches, even if they questioned them in their hearts. Children learned early to distinguish what could be said at home from what was repeated in class. A misplaced comment, even from a child, could bring unexpected consequences. The walls, people whispered, had ears. Yet beneath the surface, a quiet resistance thrived, not with open protest, but through subtle expressions of personal truth. Citizens adapted, crafting a language layered with irony, humor, and careful ambiguity. A raised eyebrow during a political broadcast, a joke told only in trusted company, or a book read late at night with curtains drawn. These were acts of private autonomy. Trust became currency, traded carefully among close friends and family. Conversations were filtered by instinct, and people learned to read between the lines. One knew which colleague could be honest and which to avoid. This was not cowardice. It was survival. Informal networks played an essential role in navigating the shortages, rules, and unpredictability of life. Want to get a decent pair of shoes or a part for a broken appliance? The state stores might not help, but someone always knew a guy. A cousin with access to supplies, a neighbor with contacts at the distribution center. These connections formed an underground web of resourcefulness. It was not just about material needs. It was also about sharing safe spaces for truth. Over dinner tables and in whispered kitchen conversations, people told stories, passed news, and discussed ideas with a level of openness that never dared cross into public settings. Even the arts and entertainment offered coded expressions of this dual existence. A film might appear to praise the system, but attentive viewers caught the subtext. A theater performance could mock bureaucracy in ways that censors missed. Writers developed a talent for ambiguity, embedding critique in allegory and metaphor. Through these carefully crafted works, citizens found a mirror reflecting the complexities they could not say aloud. At times, this internal tension between the external performance and internal skepticism created a heavy psychological burden. Living with dual realities demanded constant vigilance. One misstep could unravel carefully built safety, but it also built a unique kind of resilience. People learned to think critically, to question, and to remember that appearances were not always truth. In this way, private spaces became sanctuaries of authenticity in a world that required masks. And yet, for all the restrictions, there was a certain unity in the shared experience. Everyone, in some form, lived this duality. There was a quiet understanding among neighbors, unspoken but deeply felt. Smiles held hidden meanings, and long silences carried trust. People helped one another not just to get by, but to preserve something more profound: dignity, identity, and humanity. This delicate dance between what was shown and what was felt defined the Soviet experience for millions. In many ways, the system had created a society that, while strictly controlled, had fostered a rich undercurrent of solidarity and inner strength. It was not the open defiance of banners and protests, but the quiet courage of a people who learned to live within the rules while keeping part of themselves untouched. That, perhaps, was the truest form of resistance. By the 1970s and early 1980s, the children who had once stood in stiff red scarves reciting oaths of loyalty were now grown. They had inherited a society in which stability reigned above all else. Their parents had lived through war, famine, and the brutal upheavals of collectivization and purges. In contrast, this new generation engineers, teachers, bureaucrats, and factory workers entered adulthood during a time of relative calm. Apartments were still cramped, queues still long, and goods still rationed. But life no longer felt constantly under siege. Predictability became its own kind of comfort. Many learned to temper their expectations, exchanging grand ideological dreams for the quiet hope that their lives would remain undisturbed. In the workplace, these younger citizens navigated rigid structures that valued endurance over innovation. Performance evaluations often hinged more on punctuality and visible compliance than on actual output or creativity. Loyalty to superiors was frequently more valuable than professional merit. To get ahead, one might join a volunteer brigade, organize a local parade, or be quoted in the company newsletter praising the latest party directive. For many, these acts became rituals, gestures performed with a knowing wink among colleagues who understood the unwritten rules of survival in a system that rewarded appearances more than substance. Outside of work, a quiet shift was underway. The old revolutionary fervor that had once energized public life gave way to a kind of managed disillusionment. People still attended official parades, but now with less intensity and more routine. Political slogans painted on walls began to fade and peel. Patriotic songs continued to play on the radio, but the passion they once stirred no longer burned as brightly. This generation did not rebel outright, but But neither did they embrace the system with the same fervent belief. Instead, they learned to live within its boundaries, adapting with a sense of quiet resilience. Culturally, the 1980s saw a subtle broadening of horizons. Youth clubs played music from the West, carefully selected and occasionally censored, but enough to spark curiosity. Black market tapes of foreign rock bands circulated in hushed exchanges. Fashion magazines showed glimpses of foreign trends, leading teenagers to improvise their own styles with what little was available. Soviet cinema, once strictly controlled, began to explore more personal themes, reflecting the inner lives and frustrations of ordinary people. Art and literature started to hint, if only gently, at the contradictions and pressures beneath the surface of daily life. In family homes, conversations remained cautious. Parents warned children never to repeat certain remarks outside. Jokes about shortages or leadership gaffes were common in kitchens, but vanished the moment strangers entered. Trust was a delicate matter, often reserved for a small circle of friends or relatives. Yet despite these limits, Soviet citizens found ways to express warmth, to build connections, and to dream in quiet, private ways. Children still played in courtyards. Students still laughed in hallways. And families still gathered over simple meals, creating moments of joy amid the monotony. By the early 1980s, signs of strain became harder to ignore. Industrial growth slowed, and even basic necessities grew harder to find. People who had grown up expecting improvement now encountered stagnation. The promise of a brighter communist future, once spoken with certainty, began to feel more like a memory. Bureaucracy ballooned, and even minor tasks required endless paperwork and connections. Frustration simmered, but the desire to protect what little security remained kept open dissent at bay. People had learned over decades to adapt without challenging. When Mikhail Gorbachev rose to power in 1985, many in this generation watched with cautious interest. His calls for glasnost and perestroika promised something different, perhaps even genuine change. Yet decades of experience had taught citizens to wait to see if the promises would hold. For many, it was not ideology that moved them, but the hope for a more livable, less constrained daily life. They did not seek to dismantle the system overnight, but they welcomed the possibility that things might finally shift in a more open direction. This was the paradox of the late Soviet period. A society forged in revolution had matured into one marked by careful negotiation with its own contradictions. Ideological rigidity still defined official rhetoric, but beneath it lay a population skilled in adaptation, longing not for upheaval but for dignity, for space to breathe and think. The children of the revolution had grown into quiet architects of survival, living lives shaped less by dogma and more by the simple pursuit of stability in a world where change, when it finally came, would be both long-awaited and deeply uncertain. For all its strictures and contradictions, life under the Soviet system held meaning for those who lived within its structure. It is easy, from the outside or from a distant future, to see only the grayness, the queues for bread, the propaganda posters, the cramped apartments, and the unrelenting surveillance. But to those on the inside, it was not merely a system, it was home. A place where one's daily rhythms, small joys, and personal connections formed a private world within the public order. People adapted, endured, and found ways to carve out space for family, for love, for purpose. For many Soviet citizens, the system offered what earlier eras of war and chaos could not: stability. Jobs were assigned, food was subsidized, and housing, though modest, was guaranteed. Children like Natasha grew up with clear expectations, surrounded by peers reciting the same lessons, singing the same songs, and celebrating the same holidays. There was pride in achievement, even if that achievement was shaped by what the state valued: to be recognized, to be promoted, to contribute to a collective goal. These things brought fulfillment in a world where choice was often limited. but meaning was not entirely absent. The sense of dignity that came from work, from being part of something larger than oneself, cannot be dismissed. A bus driver in Leningrad, a nurse in a provincial town, a teacher in the Urals, each knew their role mattered. They may not have been free to question authority openly, but within the silent bonds of community, they found solidarity. The babushkas in the courtyard, the factory workers on break, the neighbors sharing stories over tea, all sustained a shared understanding of what it meant to live well, even within limitations. Of course there was hardship. Rations ran thin. Travel was restricted. Dreams that did not align with the official narrative had to be tucked away, whispered only to those deeply trusted. People learned to live in layers: outward compliance and inward questioning. But in navigating those layers, they developed resilience, humor, and a rich inner world. The jokes told in kitchens, the looks exchanged in meetings, the poems scribbled in the margins of notebooks. These were acts of quiet survival and sometimes even quiet rebellion. As time passed and reforms began to emerge under Gorbachev, the cracks in the system widened. Younger generations began to imagine something different, not necessarily because they despised what came before, but because they were ready for change. They were shaped by their parents' endurance, but sought their own freedom. They wanted to travel, to speak freely, to listen to Western music. Without fear, the ideals of the older generation did not disappear, but they evolved. The desire for structure gave way to a desire for possibility. Still, when the Soviet Union collapsed, it left behind not only a failed ideology, but also a deep well of memory. For many, especially those who had known only that life, the sudden loss of structure was not liberation, it was disorientation. The certainties, however limiting, had been a foundation. In their absence, some felt abandoned, others betrayed. Yet even then, the bonds of community, forged through decades of shared experience, remained. Those ties did not dissolve with the red flag. They endured in stories, in rituals, in songs sung quietly by the elderly to their grandchildren. So as we reflect on Soviet life, not as a monolith of oppression, nor as a paradise lost, but as a complex, deeply human experience, we begin to understand how ordinary people shaped and were shaped by extraordinary systems. They did not choose the context, but they chose how to live within it, how to find pride in small victories, and how to love amidst constraint. Thank you for joining us in this journey through time and memory. If this story moved you or gave you a new perspective, please consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a like. It truly helps us bring more thoughtful content to light. Feel free to share your own thoughts or family stories in the comments below. Until next time, take care of each other, and as always, sleep well.